This is where he, Pierre Ibisch, spends more and more time in the forest, not for recreational purposes, but because he is concerned. The biologist travels through forest areas all over Germany and in many parts of the world. He wants to know how the forest is doing. How are trees coping with climate change? How are forests reacting to increasing heat and drought? Today, he is making a flying visit to the Nature Symphony in Lower Franconia, a hillside forest with old stands of trees and natural streams. After a quite long dry period, it's raining today.
Wonderful.
They're happy about the rain. That it's raining today is really an exception. Normally, we really have to deal with extreme dryness.
Now that also makes the same impression here, as if it were moist. But if you look more closely, you can see the symptoms of drought stress even here. See?
How can you tell, for example, how a forest is doing, particularly with these changed climatic conditions?
Well, if you look around and see dead trees that aren't very old, then you might wonder, how come? That can happen in a nearly natural forest. In any case, there are always large numbers of standing trees that are dead, but they are usually older. You can also see that back there, many tree crowns simply show that they are very transparent. Certain tree species are obviously more affected. The beech trees, the brown leaves. You have to differentiate as you look.
Then let's look at that a little more closely. Wow, that's an old tree, isn't it? It has so much moss here.
It's quite wonderful, in fact. And especially wonderful is that it's an ash tree, which we worry about nationwide, Europe-wide, since a fungal disease has been decimating many populations of ash trees for some years. Many local stands are completely wiped out. Seldom do you actually see such old ash trees, which are so, well, leafy, that actually speaks for the location here. This is certainly a very old forest floor. So it's nice to see such an ash tree. It's a bit inclined here on the slope. That's why the water runs down more on the side. You can see these mosses on it. Indeed, a tree rich in structure. You don't see something like that in commercial forests, do you? There, they have to grow up straight, and in this respect, these are special places. Yes, this is here an old beech. It should be at least 150 years old, I would estimate. It's still good and leafy. That's also pleasing to see. But you can also see here, in connection with other trees, that's the observation at the moment, that actually the trees also still protect each other when it gets so extremely hot and warm. You can see a few signs above, in the periphery, the fine branches, that they are a bit more transparent. But basically that's quite good compared to most beech trees, as they otherwise look presently. It's actually a tree species that is very relevant for Germany, that would dominate most of the forests. A tree species that has been strongly pushed back, of course, by land use and forest use. And we only have very few areas left where really really old beech trees occur. Where there is strong interference, many trees are removed. The whole tree canopy is torn open, and then these are actually the ones that suffer very strongly. The beech is quite susceptible. For example, a beech trunk that suddenly stands free and is strongly exposed to the sun is extremely endangered. That's why it's so important that they always stand together, and that's what the beeches actually do if you let them. They form these very dense stands, and, well, ultimately, what needs they have hasn't been taken into consideration, and it's always gone well as long as the summers weren't so hot and dry.
You say that the trees do quite well if they are left alone. I think that's ultimately a problem for the forestry industry as well.
Clearly, these forests that are now affected by this climate change are in a landscape that has also been heavily used for millennia. The forests have actually been chopped up into small islands, you could say. Road networks are laid in, there are back roads, sometimes even 20 meters. These are then aisles in which the sun also reaches the ground, where then also high temperatures exist in the forest interior. The evaporation gets high. Of course, climate change comes into play as well. And in the meantime, if we have to deal with temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius also in the forests, that's critical. And if this progresses, it will simply also become critical for more and more tree species, and that's not something people like to talk about. But I can already see certain patterns where there has been more intensive use in the end, especially the native trees of the nearly natural forests suffer much more.
Road networks, forest aisles, logging roads. Modern forestry, which the biologist holds partly responsible for the crisis of the forest, is a European invention, as it were. Already in ancient times and the Middle Ages, forests were cleared on a large scale to create land for settlement, agriculture, and grazing. Huge quantities of wood were also consumed for shipbuilding or for firewood. Timber became scarce, and further economic development was at risk. The solution to the timber crisis was to plant new trees. So trees were planted, and very neatly, in rows and rows of trees. Monocultures were created, forests that could be processed efficiently, where a single person could clear hundreds of trees in a morning, equal portions of the same kind of trees, sized to fit the sawmill.
We have actually forgotten a bit about how ecosystems develop and what they need, if necessary, to cope with environmental changes. And we can actually say that these monocultures in particular, but also other forms of intense forestry, ultimately mean that work is being done against the ecosystem. And these are things that I think are now hitting us a bit hard. The monocultures of these conifers are susceptible in various ways. Their susceptibility to storms has been known for a long time now. The severe storms we've had also led to a lot of storm damage. There was lots of wood that couldn't be harvested and trees were then weakened. This then led to the fact that the bark beetle was invited to hold a feast, and
which then further damages the trees and they become even weaker ultimately.
Right. And then came the heat in addition to the drought, above all, which leads to the fact that the trees shut down their defenses, and then the pests come fully into play. And so we ultimately have an escalation of a process, but also a systemic interaction. So this is a very complex process. It's not so easy to explain in one sentence, and it's just not so that climate change is solely to blame.
Now we are in a woods that fortunately is not a monoculture, but one where there is a relatively diverse tree population and also an old tree population. You said that different trees also protect or support each other during harsh periods. Can you say something more about that?
Well, often our image of nature is still characterized somehow by the struggle for existence, which is a bit outdated. In fact, in mature ecosystems, there are many interactions that are positive between trees of one species, for example, but also across species boundaries, for example, that they shade each other and so on. Mycorrhizal is also known as a phenomenon in which trees interact via fungal symbiosis with the roots of the trees. They can exchange substances and can certainly also downright support each other in solidarity, especially in places where the forest has had the opportunity to develop for a long time and where there are no constant disturbances. For example, where the soil is compacted, where perhaps these fungus tree root networks are also cut up by traffic, etc.
And yet, in such a diverse natural woods like this one, there are some trees that have really had problems with the heat and also long periods of drought.
Yes, I saw just there a dead beech tree. First of all, this is also a natural process in such an ecosystem, also ultimately part of the adaptation that, if the climate then develops in a different direction, then certain species no longer adapt so well. They fall away. And then, accordingly, we see there, actually, light areas develop and other tree species can grow up that can potentially cope better with the situation now.
Shall we have a look at that?
Yes, gladly.
The Nature Symphony is a natural forested area that is unparalleled with its extensive tree population. A large variety of native tree species are at home here. Ash, hornbeam, and beech grow here alongside linden, oak, wild cherry, sycamore, and Norway maple. The sloped forest, which is interspersed with ravines and located close to the banks of the main river, is considered a natural landmark and provides a refuge for many animals. Even the rare and strictly protected beaver is at home here. That one really doesn't look so good.
No, it's dead. It's an old beech. It has clearly stood by itself for a long time. See? It's gotten lots of sun and heat from the slope. It's been struggling for a few years now. You can see the broken branches. It has tried to form new branches there in order to shade the trunk. That's very important. And that wasn't enough.
Oh, it has grown these side branches to keep the trunk cooler.
Right. If a trunk is strongly exposed to sunlight, then it is obviously stimulated to grow branches. But now they have withered. That is, they have died, which makes a difference in the forest. We are now standing in a light area, which means that the trees all around get more light. And that's part of the natural dynamics of the primeval forest. That when individual trees die, this light comes in and new ones get a chance. My guess would be that no beech trees are growing here right now. We see elderberry. It has also partially suffered greatly, so everything is quite critical here at the moment.
So now, a victim of climate change. Can we see it that way?
Beech are certainly one of the first victims of climate change, and in many places this is accelerated by forest management.
At the same time, beech trees find optimal growing conditions in our latitudes. If people did not intervene in nature through forestry, Our native forests would consist mostly of beech trees. These stately trees can live up to 400 years. But in areas under forestry management, they're harvested, as it is called, that is cut down after only 120 years. For a long time, beech was considered a tree that copes reasonably well with heat and drought. When it's too dry for them, beech trees shed their leaves to save water, and then sprout new ones the following summer. But climate change and forestry practices have also pushed the beech to its limits. Half of the beech trees in Germany are already damaged, and the trend is rising.
This often starts with discoloration on the trunk. We then see fungi growing on it.
This black one there,
These black spots, see? Which then mean that there is something in there that triggers root rot, other fungi that then restrict the water supply. It's always a complex phenomenon, and with such a long-lived, large organism, which often does not die overnight, these are then processes that stretch out over years. In some cases, you only see them very late, and now just this combination of so many warm and dry summers is simply too much for them now, although they previously could somehow grow here for 150 years.
well, this means that the tree did not die from the fungus, but the fungus came because the tree was already in very bad shape and weakened?
I think that actually it's often difficult to say what the trigger ultimately was. These are complex events. There are also bark beetles for beech, so in the end, multiple organ failure. And I think it's also not always so very clear in order to determine what exactly organisms died from.
You mentioned multiple organ failure. I think of a person in times of climate change or when it's really hot who then gets circulatory problems. How is it for the organism tree with climate change, with heat and drought?
Well, there are no organs like in animals, but areas that are responsible for nutrient intake. The fine root systems, which are damaged when the soil simply dries out very much, when perhaps the mycorrhizal fungi are also damaged. That is, from the root tips there are problems, and in the end the tree starves to death because it has to close the stomata. Then the tree can no longer photosynthesize properly in the leaves, but ultimately it does not get any water, and then the defense systems against the pests fail.
How old do you think this tree was?
I think about 120 to 150 years.
Just think, 150 years of all that it has already experienced, several wars and good and bad times.
Yeah.
And now within a few years, due to climate change, its life has ended.
Right, and definitely before the maximal age of a beech tree.
The forest, Nature Symphony, which is cared for by the International Gabriela Foundation, is exempted from the usual forestry practices. This means that trees may grow old. Many of the trees standing here are 200 to 300 years old. In this natural forest, people intervene in the growing and dying of the trees as little as possible.
Yes, there's quite a bit of dead wood. That's very interesting.
That one there has been dead for a long time, but
Exactly. That one lies here certainly 1 to 2 decades already. And that's a quite important element in the forest ecosystem. Unfortunately, one that is missing in the commercial forests because for economic reasons, there is little room for trees that grow old, die, and then lie around. So we have a large lack of deadwood, and it's very important for the organisms that live in it. But ultimately, there are also very important ecological functions. Here is just nice to see. So on the one hand, this slow decomposition, you see,
Wow.
we can put our hand in here. That's ultimately like wonderful
almost earth.
planting substrate, isn't it? And that's exactly what we see here. Here plants germinate in it on the deadwood, and this substrate is actually like a sponge and really stores water, so that's good. For example, here for the young beech, which has the perfect germination substrate. It's a bit elevated. There's now no competition for light with other plants, so several advantages that result from this. Thus, it's also a part of microhabitat diversity. There's always the indication of how important it really is to grasp, in the truest sense of the word, to reach in there and find out how moist it is. It's been dry for weeks. It didn't really pull down the water that's down there from the rainfall. And you can imagine, if there's a lot of it lying here, you can also say it's about to start dripping. Because it is dripping, that's for me something that's touching in these dry summers, that simply the water is stored, but not from the rocks, not from the bare soil, but
From the dead wood.
from the dead trees.
Like a sponge, really.
Yeah.
Forest areas are huge water reservoirs. With its countless cavities, pores, and underground channels, 1 hectare of forest soil can store up to 3 million liters of water. The treetops also catch some of the rainwater and release it slowly, drop by drop to the ground, where it is stored by mosses and the humus layer. Where forests are absent, rain can hardly be retained. It runs off the surface, taking fertile soil with it. Floods and high water are the result. The water storage capacity of a former forest can then hardly be replaced by a dam. How will it continue for this beech? Will this here become soil and it will then put roots into the soil?
The roots will now grow down here, and at some point you will no longer see that it once grew up on a piece of deadwood. At some point it will stand normally on the forest floor, and this effect now, soil, water storage, is not only relevant for these small trees, here also a sycamore maple, but for the entire forest. We see that here, this is a slope forest, actually a difficult situation for such a forest, which needs it to be moist. We see everywhere the debris, so the soil is very shallow, and a lot of what is important for these trees happens here in the uppermost soil layers, which were actually produced by the forest itself, and that's often somewhat forgotten. The forest makes its own climate, it makes its own plant pot, it makes its own water reservoir.
If you let it.
If you let it.
That means you probably won't find something like that in a usual forest, or only rarely.
Very rarely. In plantations, not at all. That's considered a waste when deadwood is lying around. Then the machines can't drive through easily, and it's simply wood that could have been harvested and somehow made into wood products.
Now there's current discussion about what to do with the dead trees that just couldn't deal with the last hot periods, and mostly it's actually been cleared out of the forest. Here again, probably it would be better to leave them, or what do you think?
I would say that if you have grasped this, had reached in here and experienced this water in the middle of the summer, it's clear that these are the only structures that will first of all rebuild or improve the forest floor in the future. And that will also become a water reservoir for us in the short term, apart from other effects, that where there's deadwood, there is still shade, etc. So this contributes significantly to ensuring that the forest remains cool and that plants can grow again. In this respect, it's relatively logical from an ecosystem point of view to leave as much wood as possible on the ground in the event of major damage. It is clear that if the forest is to grow up again as quickly as possible, how is that supposed to work on a bare area that then heats up strongly? 40 centigrades is then nothing, 50 centigrades and more are then reached. Isn't it then logical to leave such structures that provide water and coolness for the regeneration of the damaged forest ecosystems? And this deadwood is a central element.
What then is the temperature difference between forest and non-forest?
That's an important question. That's actually relevant across all scales. If you look at such a piece of deadwood, it is so that coolness is created just by the water that evaporates. This can be measured in the vicinity of this piece of deadwood, and if we then go to the whole area, we see that such a forest is cooler than other landscape components, and clearly, the larger these forest areas are, the more cooling there is. Forests are a kind of cooling unit of the landscape. That's an everyday experience. If you step out of the forest onto a clearing or a field, the difference can be 10 to 20 degrees.
Up to 20 degrees centigrade?
Definitely. That depends then on how the surrounding countryside is. But in a dry summer, such a bare field easily heats up almost like a concrete surface. And then, where does the cool air come from? And in the landscape, it comes, if not from the ocean, then actually only from the forest.
So good that you're here. Can we say that the forest is smarter than human beings?
That should always be answered with caution if related to or compared with people. But actually, it's like this. An ecosystem has this experience that has developed in the context of evolution, and so certain mechanisms are pronounced. How does such a system deal with disturbances, with climate change? And precisely in this interaction of organisms, there are corresponding solutions which, if you will, also indicate cleverness and are possibly superior to our knowledge. And we should definitely not overestimate ourselves.
Also ultimately respect.
It's also a matter of respect for what has developed here and a little caution in relation to this overestimation of ourselves, not to say hubris. Look, how long have we been practicing forestry? We are talking a bit more than 300 years. And what are 200 to 300 years in the life of a tree? What are 200, 300 years in the life of an ecosystem which has been doing this for thousands of years? Ecosystems are economical systems that have to deal sparingly with nutrients and water. And there are really a lot of solutions still in such ecosystems that we don't have to reinvent, and in many cases probably couldn't either.
That means that even in times of climate change, the forest actually also has forces to cope with it in some form or another.
In any case, I think we have to remain realistic. We know that when certain limits are exceeded, a forest ecosystem can also collapse, and we should do everything possible to prevent that. We have to put the brakes on climate change, and we can't rely on the forest somehow coping with it. I can already envision scenarios in the next few decades, if this continues unchecked, that these self-healing powers that the forest has will also be overloaded.
That actually then means that we have to say goodbye to the forest as we know it today.
Yes, I think that in the near future we will see large areas of forest that are, well, shrubbery or bare areas. When we go to Saarland, it's already that way. In the Harz region and in more and more regions in Germany, there are actually wooded areas that aren't covered by forest.
So that today we can walk through such a damp, slightly rainy forest may soon be something special?
Yes, it definitely does you good.
Yes, it does good.
And to see that the water is also absorbed and first stored. Just imagine if there were no trees here and only the rocks. The little bit of water would be in the Main River down there in a few minutes.
How beneficial is a walk in the forest? The good air, all the greenery, the life that surrounds you. The symphony of nature with its giant trees and its primeval forest-like character is a special gem. One of the many ravines begins with a picturesque waterfall. Oh, but that's unusual here to have water in the forest like that, or isn't it?
Actually not. It should be like that. It's good to see after the dry season, in fact, that this forest still manages to feed such a spring, yes. Such ravines have a very important function, also as relict places for certain species which simply need it cool. We heard that fire salamanders occur here. These are, of course, the decisive places.
Mr. Ibisch, you look at many forests to check out their conditions. So what is your conclusion at the moment? How is the forest doing?
Well, I think there is a consensus among virtually all experts that this is a historical situation, so probably the forest has never been this bad, especially not since we've been looking at the state of the forest. For centuries, in fact, such a drought has not been experienced in Germany. The soils are actually dried out deep down, as we know. And after we started to worry the year before last and said, well, if this goes on for another year or 2 years, then it's going to be serious. It's like this, that many forests are collapsing now. And that is a disturbing picture.
Are there any key indicators, statistics, or where can you also establish that you can see that they are all dying off?
The official statistics, which spoke already 1 to 2 months ago of the fact that the damaged area in the forest is at least as large as Saarland, and that's a very large forested area. And these figures are certainly too low and will be corrected again upwards at the end of the year. Particularly, the last hot spell in August gave many stands another real boost in terms of deterioration.
Considering these areas that are now disappearing due to the climate change, should one actually still cut down trees?
I would say that at the moment we need to protect the still healthy mixed deciduous forests in particular, which doesn't mean I would want to declare them all a national park now, but actually we need a moratorium, a logging moratorium. That's how far it is now, where really the deciduous trees still look good. The use of wood now is completely irrational anyway, because the wood markets are clogged and flooded with damaged wood, which is still available in reasonable qualities. But the market can't absorb it at the moment. So you have to consider, here too is the damaged wood, which has to be cleared away, like damage, like dirt, like something that is lying on the road after an accident. Or should we just redefine it into neutral deadwood or into future wood, ultimately which would rebuild the soils on the land if left there? That's another urgent plea. But all the same, it's not presently justifiable that still living, healthy trees are being felled.
Heavy machinery is used to remove economically usable trees from the forest. In the process, the forest floor is compacted, and the soil structure that has developed over centuries is destroyed. The fine pores in which water can be stored, in which aeration can take place, in which organisms live, are closed. The oxygen supply is also disrupted, with the result that the organisms in the soil can no longer do their job. And the biologist explains that what is once destroyed does not recover. A pore that has been closed will not reopen. It takes centuries for a new layer of humus to form on the compacted soil. And yet, in forestry, heavy machinery continues to be used on a huge scale in forests that are already weakened.
We live in a country in which clear-cutting was outlawed. That must be said quite clearly. And now it is happening again, and not 1 hectare large, but also 5, 8, 10, and 15 hectares, and so on. Gigantic areas where not only this compaction happens, but where the microclimate actually changes dramatically, areas that dry out more, and the organisms that remain in the soil have a harder time, which means that the plants that are supposed to grow there, the new trees, have a harder time. And so it's just worth looking at areas that could show us what the alternative could look like when we don't clear the wood or let dead trees stand. These areas are even cooler. Moisture is held. And if we look closely, native tree species are still germinating everywhere, but which are now no longer considered worthy. So it's a bit like this in forestry. On the one hand, the trust in the native ecosystem has been lost. On the other hand, it is also in the economic interest that people are afraid that trees will grow up that they can't sell just as well. That is certainly very short-term thinking, isn't it? It seems to some that we could lose 5 years of tree growth where trees would have to grow, which will later sell at a high price. One thing is quite clear. With changes in technology and demand, we cannot know which wood will be in demand. But what we do know, there will most likely be greater extremes, higher temperatures, more droughts. So I think we need to discover a forest now also in terms of its other ecosystem services.
So cooling, water storage.
Yes, these are services that it always provides so far anyway. Yes, we take them with us, but maybe society has to discover them in the sense that it says, okay, that's worth something to us. And that's not happening at the moment. And I think society as a whole should also be involved. Well, we could allow ourselves that. We could take 2 or 3 years and say, wait a minute, we have a huge problem with the forest. So what should happen now? How do we want the forest to look? How important is it to us that there are places where we can go to relax, perhaps more important than ever in difficult times, and that means we then also finance the forestry, the forester, the forest owners for ensuring that the forest can remain as healthy as possible, that it can perform this service well. But of course, it is then relevant that we do not pay money afterwards somehow, for example, to foresters who are doing exactly that now, clearing these areas and planting some supposedly super trees that should bring lots of money for wood in the future. Because these new plantations are bad in terms of the ecosystem services we need now.
And if I've understood right, that means you would be in favor of paying a forest owner that he let his forest be forest, then for the wood that he harvests.
Yes, and that also seems to be a bit dishonorable. So somehow there is also this position, perhaps somehow understandable. Forest managers are engineers. They design, they practice silviculture, it's also called that. And to say to them now, you get paid for doing nothing, that's somehow not compatible. I can also imagine that trees are planted, but I would rather plant them at the edge of the forest. Well, that we see that the mangled forest scenery in Germany is a bit rounded off, that the smallest forest islands are combined so that they are stronger on a larger area, that they cool themselves better, can hold more water, that we actively shape the forest edge more toward the fields so that the heat does not directly hit the high forest, that we have more hedges and copses. There are things that we've actually always wanted to do for good nature conservation reasons that will be good for agriculture and that will also benefit the forest. And in the forest, as long as it's possible, look at what it can do with its own self-healing powers. Important in the forest is that when you take something out, you don't get it back again. So when you now take out wood, it's gone. When the ground is bare, it's simply bare. And afterwards you won't bring trees back there again. And then you might think, perhaps it was good after all. That means that it is very easy now to create irreversible conditions, and when it comes to this, I advise you to wait a few moments longer, to discuss it, to analyze it, to receive all the research that is already available, and then to develop holistic strategies. And that's not presently happening.
The condition of the forest is not only worrying in Central Europe. There is hardly a region in the world where the forests are not struggling to survive. Biologists are particularly concerned about the tropical rainforest. The green lungs of the planet are threatened with collapse. Global warming and large-scale clearing have changed the local climate significantly, so that the remaining rainforest is now on the brink of collapse. The subarctic forests of the northern hemisphere are also increasingly endangered. These boreal coniferous forests in Canada, Russia, Sweden, or Finland make up about a third of the global forest area. But here too, area-wide clear-cutting for the wood and paper industry. The last primeval forests of the taiga are disappearing, 2.5 million hectares every year, and climate change does the rest. Where it doesn't rain for months, every lightning bolt is enough to cause a forest fire. Whether through clearing or through the direct consequences of climate change, around 10 million hectares of forest are lost every year around the globe. An area the size of Iceland. You travel around the world. You are someone who feels strongly connected to the forest. How do you feel personally when you realize in recent years that this organism, the forest, is doing so badly?
Well, you wouldn't be human if you weren't strongly affected by it. And when you know all that depends on it, and all that could come, and also the suffering of people that's connected with it.
How do you view the worst case, or if you imagine toward what this could still accelerate?
If we look at just the climatological scenarios alone and assume that by the end of the century it could be 4 to 5 degrees warmer globally, this will lead to very, very big problems in many regions, where droughts and fire regimes simply become too overwhelming and forests are then replaced by other ecosystems. In the end, even a desert is still an ecosystem. And there will be regions in the tropics where it just gets too hot for human life. And indeed, you can also imagine what kind of conflicts can then, of course, be triggered.
Nevertheless, you are still a fighter for the forest. How likely do you think it is that humankind manages this?
There are not too many indications yet, but the principle of hope has always been an important one, and I know from complex systems that they do not develop linearly, just as climate change accelerates at some point and degradation accelerates. But it is also the case that positive change cannot start linearly if suddenly more and more people recognize something and then political processes really start that go in the right direction. It is not about us taking everything for ourselves, but rather that we have to limit ourselves because there also has to be enough to go around. So we have to be frugal. This is a very difficult message, I think. We have to recognize that this ecosystem, which has grown over millions of years, has become more and more efficient, and we are now in the process of attacking this efficiency from different sides, of reducing it, and this has to stop.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
You're welcome.
Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, liebe Zuschauerinnen.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, welcome. Weather extremes, natural disasters and heat records just keep on coming. We're in the midst of the climate change. Meanwhile, global warming has risen 1.3 degrees centigrade as compared to the pre-industrial level. The devastating forest fires in California with nearly 40 deaths, 100,000 evacuees, thousands of destroyed houses are only one of the severe disasters that are linked to the climate change. Strong storms have swept over northern Germany, and in recent months there were devastating hurricanes, typhoons, floods, heat waves, long-lasting droughts, rockfalls as a result of the thawing permafrost, etc., etc. What disasters will break in over this earth when global warming has reached 2 degrees?
In the long run, the destabilization of the climate is also destabilizing our society. The consequences of global warming lead to considerable economic damages. They also damage people's health, intensify the causes of migration, and jeopardize the developmental perspectives for the poorest of the world. At the end of September, the International Monetary Fund documented the effects of climate change with concrete figures. They indicate that the world needs to be remapped. The IMF expressed the concern that due to the climate change, a mass migration is looming. The rising ocean levels could, for instance, trigger significant migratory movements across national borders. Hundreds of millions of people would be forced to leave their homeland. The economies hardest hit by climate change shelter 60% of the world's population. And already at present, 40% of people in low-income countries suffer every year from floods, droughts, or storms. The fact is that our planet Earth is already in the midst of the climate disaster, with steeply rising damage records.
It is widely agreed that an active limitation of global warming is necessary, and regular international climate summits and climate agreements give the impression that politicians are working intensely for climate protection. When before the federal election in Germany, Angela Merkel was addressed concerning compliance with the climate target agreed to in Paris, she reiterated, for example, "We will find ways to meet our 40% goal by 2020. I promise you that." I don't know if while making this promise, Angela Merkel already had her fingers crossed behind her back. In any case, several weeks later, it became public knowledge that according to internal calculations of the Federal Ministry for the Environment, a significant gap exists before reaching the climate protection goal. Officially, by 2020, the federal government is still aiming to reduce climate-damaging emissions by 40% below 1990 levels. But without readjustment, by 2020, we can expect at best a reduction of 32.5%. A missed target of this magnitude would be, as stated in the paper of the Federal Ministry for the Environment, a considerable setback for Germany's climate protection policy.
Moreover, the German climate protection goals of reducing only 40% of CO2 emissions by 2020 and 80% by 2050 are considered by climate experts to be completely inadequate. And it has been pointed out for years that the measures taken will not even achieve these completely inadequate goals in Germany. For example, in November of 2016, the Energy Watch Group published an extensive article entitled "German Climate Policy: From Trailblazer to Brakeman." It stated that the sole way out would be a policy that consistently focuses on avoiding, not on reducing, emissions. Reality will show whether the big words of politicians will eventually be followed by action. At present, however, it looks like it could already be too late. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe already wrote, "That's enough words for the moment. Now let me see some action." While you're handing out the compliments, you should also make things happen.
The topic of climate change is also gladly discussed by German politicians with Pope Francis. In June of 2017, after her private audience with the Pope, Angela Merkel announced, "The Pope encouraged me to fight for climate agreements." And in October, in his private audience with the Pope, the German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier also spoke with the Pope on the climate change. It is not known what significance is actually given to the topic of climate change during these private audiences that take place under exclusion of the public. We cannot help feeling that neither the Pope nor the German government can have a serious interest in the fight against climate change. Or have you already heard a clear appeal to abstain from meat, for instance, from the Pope or the governing party with a C for Christian in its name? And yet, that is precisely the one measure for reducing global warming that would be easiest to implement. For years, it has been known that a large part of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from keeping and processing livestock. The percentage is thus higher than that of all worldwide traffic.
All those who are committed to the protection of our climate, who advocate for life, the life of our fellow human beings, as well as the life of nature and the animals on our planet Earth, will abstain from the murder of our fellow creatures. By so doing, they also act as it is the will of God, the creator of all life. Even in the story of creation in the Bible of the priests, we can read that God gave the people the fruits of the field for food, and He created the animals as His friends and not as foodstuff. All those who announce the opposite and adhere to the tradition of killing clearly show which system they serve, the system of killing and of destroying. God, the Eternal, the Creator of all life, and His Son, the Christ of God, are for the life. The life that lives the love for God and neighbor toward human beings, nature and animals. And not by their words, but by their actions do people demonstrate which system they serve. Dear viewers, dear listeners, with these thoughts, we take our leave of you for today. We wish you all the best. Until next time, goodbye and greetings in God.